ही व्यक्ति को महान बनाता है और अभिवादन करने से चार वस्तुएं इंसान की बढ़ती हैं। तो इसलिए क्योंकि हमारे लिए पूरे को दुनिया के लिए वो सम्मानीय है, इसलिए उन्होंने संकेत दिया।
So with regard to the Four Noble Truths, together with its 16 attributes, you should actually make notes of these. So the impermanence, suffering, emptiness, and selflessness, which are the four attributes of suffering, and then the four attributes of origin of suffering. The four attributes of the origin of suffering are that it's a cause, that it's a source of all suffering, and then that it's a thara cause, and then that it's the and the condition. And then the four attributes of cessation, the true cessation, are called the cessation, peace, and then the third one is called excellence, and then the fourth one is called the definite emergence. And then the four attributes of path are known as the path. The first one is path, and second is the awareness or knowledge, and then the third one is the practice, and then the fourth one is the means to definite emergence. So in this way you have to keep in mind these four noble truths together with the 16 attributes. And then the Buddha, when he gave teaching on the Four Noble Truths, he first gave the identity of the Four Noble Truths, saying this is the Noble Truth of suffering, and this is the origin of suffering, and so forth. And then the Buddha went on to say that you must know what suffering is, and to overcome the origin of suffering, actualize the cessation, and then cultivate the path. And having said that, he said, what is the purpose of doing these practices? Then he said that by applying this teaching on the Four Noble Truths, to developing the path within yourself, and to actualizing the cessation. And so he says that he asks if it is possible for us to overcome suffering and reach the goal of cessation or liberation. And so once you have reached, so once you have understood what suffering is and overcome suffering completely, then there is nothing to be overcome. And therefore, he says, no suffering, but there's nothing to be known or understood. And he also goes on to say that one should overcome the origin of suffering. Of course, through the application of the path, one can overcome the origin of suffering. But once you have overcome this origin of suffering, there is nothing to be overcome. And then the third, regarding the third noble truth, the true cessation, he says that one should actualize the cessation, but then once you have completely reached that goal of cessation, then there's nothing to be actualized. And similarly, with regard to the path, he says you must actualize or cultivate the path, but then once you have journeyed through the path and reached the goal, then there is nothing to be cultivated as the path. And so in this way, he goes through the Four Noble Truths and taught the Four Noble Truths 3 times. First, with regard to the identity of the Four Noble Truths, saying this is the suffering, noble truth of suffering, this is the origin of suffering, this is the cessation, true cessation, this is the true path to leading to cessation. And then he mentions that he also exhorts the disciples to know the suffering, to overcome origin, and then to so with regard to the functionality of the Four Noble Truths, in relation to the Four Noble Truths, he mentions these, and then finally there's nothing to be known, nothing to be overcome, and so forth. So so the Buddha Dharma, which teaches these Four Noble Truths, is based on the philosophical understanding or concept of dependent origination, and therefore within which we have the causality within samsara, the afflicted causality of afflictions, and then the causality with regard to liberation. And so with regard to the first set of the causality of afflictions, the truth of related with afflictions, we have the 12 links of dependent origination, starting with ignorance, giving rise to karma, the format of karma, and then leaving its imprint on this consciousness. And then when you actually overcome ignorance, then you also stop the creation of karma and so forth, and then therefore you reverse the 12 links of dependent origination, or stop the working of the 12 links of dependent origination, and therefore you have, in relation to this, you have the teaching pertaining to the cessation, liberation. And therefore, with regards to this teaching of selflessness, it is more elaborately taught in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. So as I explained, the first 4 attributes of suffering, and then with regard to the origin of suffering, the 4 attributes are cause, the source of all, and then the thorough cause, and thorough cause or giving rise to the effect, and then the condition. So there are different explanations of these 4 attributes according to the different texts, such as the text that we study in Abhisamaya Alamkara and so forth. But with regard to the Asangas, Master Asangas, Abhidhamma Samuccaya, with regard to the cause, the first attribute, he says that things do not come without cause, or things do not come about through some kind of external force called a creator God. This creator God, which is said to be someone who is uncreated but self-created, self-evolved, or eternally existing. And so from such a being, things do not come. In other words, through the will of God or Ishvara, things do not come. And then, with regard to the second attribute of origin, which is the source of all, or the origin, He says that they do not come from some kind of a primal force. Because if the product or what is created is impermanent, then it must be the case that the cause which gives rise to it also is impermanent. And therefore, the cause which gives rise to a result or a fruit must also be impermanent. Something which has the potential to give rise to it, the effect. And then, with regard to the third attribute, the thorough arisal or giving rise to. So since the fruit is suffering, it is said that they are rooted in ignorance. All of us do not want suffering, but we are bound by suffering. Why? Because of ignorance. And therefore, ignorance has the potential to give rise to suffering, and therefore it is the potential cause. And together with it comes the two reinforcing factors of karma, which are the craving and grasping. And so when you think along these four attributes of the origin of suffering, we can see that the suffering comes from ignorance, which is helped by craving and grasping, or craving and appropriation. And then we have also the pain and pleasure experiences, which are also rooted in ignorance. So if this ignorance is something which is totally contrary to what reality is, which sees the reality contrary to what it is, what we can see is that it can be overcome through its antidote or counterforce. And when you see that it can be overcome through counterforce, then you can see the visibility of cessation as well. And therefore, suffering and its origin are not permanent. They are not eternal. So then you may ask, if cessation is something which is not created as such, then what's the use of gaining it or attaining it? Of course, when you attain cessation, what you actually experience is peace, a true peace within your mind. And therefore, cessation is actualized, and then that also, with that, you have a peaceful experience in mind, and then when you overcome these negative emotions, then that peace is really excellent peace, a true, perfect peace. And therefore, we are going through the four attributes of cessation. And then what you also find is that cessation is something which is eternal. Now, once you have reached that liberation, you will not have any negative emotions arising within your mind. Therefore, the negative emotions are eternally gone from your mind, and therefore, it is a definite emergence. And therefore, with regard to suffering, the Buddha was actually mainly focusing on the conditioning, pervasive existential suffering, and not just the suffering of suffering and changeable suffering. So with regard to this third type of deeper suffering, you actually have to give deep thought to it, and not just hear the teaching on this kind of suffering, but Because it is said that with regard to the suffering of suffering, which is the painful, obvious painful experiences, even the animals do not want that and know that as suffering. And then with regard to changeable suffering, it is said that even the non-Buddhist practitioners who have attained the concentration realms, concentration of the form realms, can see that they are also unwanted. So even they can be in a state where they are temporarily free from the obvious suffering and changeable suffering. Therefore, for us as Buddhists, we have to understand what the deeper suffering, which is this conditioning, pervasive existential suffering is. And that in turn, you have to cultivate for that a path which has to do with the understanding of selflessness, which means seeing the reality as it is. And therefore, you have to have this path, seeing selflessness, and the path is awareness or cognitive, because it sees the reality as it is. And therefore, this kind of path cannot be gained just through hearing the teaching or nor just reflecting on the teaching, but through meditation. Therefore, it is relied on or dependent on the path or practice. And then this actually is the means leading to that definite emergence. Therefore, it is called the factor leading to that definite emergence. So based on the philosophical concept of causality, the laws of causality, you should understand the causality within the suffering and its origin. And therefore, you have to think about the suffering of samsara in its course. So, with regard to the true path, it refers to the path which is within an Arya being, which sees selflessness directly. And so this is the direct antidote to the origin of suffering, which counters the four wrong notions of seeing what is impermanent as permanent and suffering as called pleasure, pleasant, and selfless as self, as having self. And then with regard to the cause, that we have suffering because we are under the influence of ignorance and so forth. And therefore, on the basis of this understanding of causality, we have the practice of the four mindfulness, such as the mindfulness of body. And then, based on that, we lead on to the mindfulness of sensations, of feelings and experiences. And then we see that why we harm others, cause pain to others, is because of not knowing the causality. So we have suffering in relation to someone whom we consider or regard as our enemy, and we have also attachment to those whom we consider as our near and dear ones. And accordingly, due to this love and hate attitude, we create karmas. And therefore, you actually meditate on the mindfulness of, or cultivate the mindfulness of experiences, and try to develop the antidote to the origin of suffering, and so with regard to the experience, it is an aspect of mind itself. unlike the things outside which have color, shape, and so forth, a mind is shapeless. It's not physical. It's not material or matter, and therefore it is immaterial. It is without any form, no color, no shape. So it's mere experience. And when you think about this mere, the mind which has this mere cognitive clarity nature, when you meditate on that, focus your mind on this. When you are able to, and you are able to differentiate between the mind and matter, you can understand that the mind momentarily changes, and therefore the self is not there in the mind itself as well. So, of course, we say I'm unhappy or happy based on our mental experiences of pain and pleasure. But when you actually look for the person within the mind, of course, there is no person within the mind that can be found. In the Chitamatra view or philosophy, they of course talk about 8 different types of consciousness. And they say that the Alaya Vijnan is the ultimate identity of a person or a being. So, except the Prasangikas who reject any objective existence or any independent existence of anything, of everything, the rest of the philosophical schools within Buddhism also, they do kind of point to or identify something within the mind or as the identity of a person. Of course, when we think about it, we can see that we can talk about ourselves and what we take as our possessions, mine and I and mine. And therefore, the consciousness is my consciousness. And so there's no consciousness actually which can be pointed to as being a person as such. And then within the mind, of course, we have the sensory perceptions, and then which are not mental, but within the mental, we have these states of mind where, for example, we go into deep sleep. And when we are in deep sleep, if we have to say the consciousness is me or oneself, then of course it's really difficult to hold on to that position. Because there is no awareness when you are in deep sleep. And then you would have to say, oh, the person is not there when he or she is in deep sleep. That's not right to say. And then if any of this, the consciousness, the mental consciousness is the identity of the person, then you would also have to say that when the person is in deep sleep, because the consciousness in waking state is not there, whereas you would say that the person is there when in the waking state, you would have to again say the person is not there during deep sleep. And so neither the gross states of mind nor the subtle states of mind can be posited as being the person as such at all. Because when the active mind is working, the subtle mind is not working, and therefore the subtle I or a person or being which is posited on that, the subtle mind is not there during the active gross state of mind. And so when you think along these lines, you would get a sense that, oh, I am not there, like. And so this temporary, momentary change of mind and transformation of mind is there. So of course, although it's momentarily changing, the basic nature of the mind is cognitive and awareness or clarity nature. And therefore, that the destructive emotions can be seen as not being in the intrinsic nature of the mind. And as in the Mahayana Uttara Tantra says, that the mind, the defilements are not the intrinsic in the mind. And therefore, you go through the mindfulness of mind in this way, and checking the gross and the subtle nature of the mind, and developing the path within. And so you would see certain aspects of the mind to be developed further, cultivated, whereas other aspects of the mind, such as negative emotions and so forth, to be discarded or overcome. And therefore you have the meditation on the mindfulness of phenomena. So when I was once in Thailand, they have actually in the monasteries some pictures of body of people who are about to die, and then pictures where the person has died. Several days have passed by after death, and then these different phases, decomposition of the body goes through. So in our text, we mentioned the 32 different impurities within the body. And so these are meant for, these are shown in the pictures in Thailand, in these monasteries. So these are meant for actually meditation on, to be used for meditation on the mindfulness of body. And so in this way, you go through the four mindfulnesses, establishing the four mindfulnesses within oneself, and then discarding or cultivating the virtues and discarding non-virtue, which is the second, the four exertions. And then when you are able to stabilize quite a bit well in this, then you can develop what is known as the miraculous feet, four miraculous feet. And then the four faculties, five faculties, which comprise of some faculty of mindfulness, concentration, and then you have the four powers, and then the sevenfold path. And also the eightfold noble path. The sevenfold path of enlightenment and the eightfold noble path can be, the sequence can be switched. So as Buddhists, we have to know these practices. And then on the basis of that, we can further add the teachings or the paths which are taught in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, to expand the understanding of the path. So now to go through the text. So the first two verses show that if we are able to tame our mind or subdue our mind, the first two, chapter 1, shows that if we are able to tame our mind, we have happiness, and if we are unable to tame our mind, we have suffering. And then, so it says in the text, this verse was spoken to bhikshu named Chakupala at Savatthi or Shravasti. And then the third verse of the first chapter is said to be, was actually uttered in Jetavan to someone by the name of Mata Kundali. So third verse says, he abused me, he beat me, he defeated me, he robbed me. In those who harbor such thoughts, hatred will never cease. And then the next verse says, he abused me, he beat me, he defeated me, he robbed me. In those who do not harbor such thoughts, hatred will cease. So what this shows is that just as you love yourself, you respect, you want respect for yourself and so forth, likewise, you should respect others, love others, and have no anger towards others. So even scientists say that if we are constantly angry and if we have constant fear and anxiety, and they actually weaken our immune system. Whereas with love and so forth, the immune system, peace of mind, actually strengthens the immune system. And so all religious traditions also teach love and compassion, and therefore they, all the religious traditions teach the practice of love, because anger and called hatred and so forth are bad for us. And then the next verse. For hatred does not cease by hatred at any time. Hatred ceases by love. This is an old rule. So just as plants actually need the different conducive conditions which give actually nurture them, and then in order to dispel any obstacles or obstructive forces, they have their own mechanism to fight them. Even for not inanimate objects, there are such things. Whereas, and similarly, in our body also, there is the defense mechanism within the body itself. Now, for sentient beings like us, human beings, in order to have the strong elements in the body, we have lots of emotions as well. So emotions also kind of invigorate kind of these elements. Whereas, like for example, if you are angry, the immediate reaction is to use our hand or our legs, because when we are threatened, then we either have to fight back or run away. Therefore, even in the bodily elements, the blood also flows more into the hands or legs. And therefore, there is this mechanism within the body to eliminate those unwanted causes which give rise to pain to us, and also to fight back and to actually protect ourselves. And then what we see with regard to hatred and anger is that anger is seen to be something which actually expels others, or and attachment is seen as something which actually brings others towards us. But they are actually related. They are kind of an illusion or distorted states of mind as well, because they are rooted or backed by this clinging to some self. So both the attachment to our near and dear ones and anger or hatred towards our adversaries or enemies, both are actually disturb our peace of mind. And this is how it is defined in the Abhidhamma Samuccaya, which says that that element which no sooner it arises within us actually disturbs our peace of mind is called negative emotions. And in the Shantideva's Bodhisattva Charya Avatara, there is mention of in Tibetan translation, nyomong nyomong sheramikipong, which means that these afflictive emotions is overcome by our wisdom, realizing selflessness, and therefore this word afflictive emotion, and actually although it is repeated 2 times in this translation, what is meant here is the one of the term for negative emotions in this translation actually refers to the feebleness of negative emotions. Because once the counter force actually comes within us and we actually are able to combat them, they cannot come back to us. So hatred cannot overcome hatred, as the text said, but it is overcome by this understanding of by love, which actually counters it. And therefore, it says it is the old rule, or and then the next verse is, the world does not know that we must all come to an end here, but those who know it, their quarrel cease at once. So in the Tibetan translation, it says, here we are guests. Because some people do not know this, we are guests, but some know this. But those who know it, their quarrels cease at once, or dissent. The term here gives the word, the term for dissent, dissent, was that? Dissent. The word that is in the Tibetan translation for guest is actually not in the English translation, it seems. The world does not know, it says the world. Does not know that we must all come to an end here, it says. So His Holiness is just wondering which is the word that is in the original Pali. First chapter, chapter 1. No, he's looking on page, what, chapter 20 or what? Is he looking at chapter 20? No. So His Holiness is asking whether the term is the word that is in Pali. Injinal tik gurmindur. Injinal tik gurmindur. The world lam shasha. Injinal tik world sin shasha. The world does not know that we must come to an end. 직된디 전부 민둘라 So, according to the Pali, the term is actually to go, not the word for guest. So what this shows is that nothing is static, nothing is eternal, but everything changes. And so when you understand that things are impermanent, when you reflect on impermanence, then your dissent will also be pacified. So our enemy is someone who actually undergoes changes, is subject to change. That change should not come from others, but it's the fact that the person is called created and is also bound to change. Then the next two verses were also taught in Shravasti to the senior and junior Nagmo, it says. So even scientists, of course, could actually see that our perceptions, the sensory perceptions, are active when they actually observe the objects, the respective objects. But as soon as you close your eyes, then you have a thought on which the image of the object that you have actually seen or heard forms. So that is on the level of conceptual mind. So, for example, we can remember things from yesterday or this morning. So, of course, whether you actually think that what was yesterday is here or not, whereas with a very strong kind of comprehension or a strong kind of feeling or not, there is this sense as if what was yesterday also persists today. So this is what happens with our concepts, our conceptual mind, whereas the sensory perceptions, to sensory perceptions, this does not happen. Because they see the things, what is immediately before them. But induced by these sensory perceptions, we have the thoughts. So these thoughts actually follow the perceptions, the sensory perceptions. And accordingly, when we see beautiful things, we tend to grow attachment in relation to beautiful sights, interesting sound, delectable tastes, and so forth. And so, according to whether the things that we see or hear and so forth are pleasant or unpleasant, we have attachment or anger. So when we are too much kind of distracted, this distraction towards the external objects called through the sensory perceptions should be restrained. So of course there is mention also of the restraining with the six faculties. which means not actually letting ourselves be carried away by the sense perceptions. So it goes on to say that he who lives according to looking for pleasure only, his sense is uncontrolled, immoderate in his food, idle and weak. Mara, the tempter, will certainly overthrow him as the wind throws down a weak tree. And he who, without looking for pleasures, his sense is well controlled, moderate in his food, faithful and strong, him Mara will certainly overthrow, any more than wind throws down a rocky mountain. So but in my discussions with scientists, I have told that, of course, you can differentiate between the sensory perceptions and thought, the conceptual thoughts. So because they have not yet paid attention to differentiating between these two, but there must be, definitely, if they really check within the brain, the activity of the brain, they may be able to see the difference between the sensory perceptions active when they are actively working, and the mental, the conceptual thoughts. Verse number 11, which says, so the verse says, they who imagine truth in untruth and see untruth in truth never arrive at truth, but follow in vain desires. So what is not true is clung onto as being true. And through such path, you will not be able to come to the essence. So what is the antidote to that, counterforce to that? It says, they who know truth as in truth and untruth is in untruth arrive at truth and follow true desire. So as opposed to the conception of what is not true, here you actually have the conception of the truth. And so we can relate this to the true conceptions of the impermanence, suffering, and selflessness and emptiness, which counter the four wrong or perceptions of permanence, pleasant and so forth, seeing things which are impermanent as permanent and so forth. Earlier, I quoted some verse which says this notion of an I or self is a devilish mind. And so this kind of mind, or the distorted perception of I, is the the root cause of all the rest of the negative emotions and suffering. And so because of this sense of I, clinging on to an I, which is autonomous and so forth, then you also have clinging to mindness. And then that in turn is extended to other external things, this, that, and so forth. And therefore you have attachment and anger, which gives rise to the creation of the karma. And therefore, in Buddhism, the teaching on selflessness to counter all these negative emotions and fundamentally this ignorance, which sees kind of some independent self. So according to the Vaibhashika school, they say that there is no substantially self-sufficient I. So because this is the truth, that thing as self, a person has no substantially self-sufficient self, and therefore you see the truth, and which counters the untruth or the false idea that there is such a self. And then the Chittamatras, and in the Chittamatra and the Madhyamaka philosophical schools, what they say is that this kind of sense of I is actually rooted in a sense of the psychophysical aggregates as having some kind of a truth. And therefore, the grasping at a self of a person is connected to the grasping of the self of a phenomena. So accordingly, there is a difference in degree of subtlety of selflessness between the Chittamatras and Madhyamakas. And therefore, and the selflessness also of a person also is said to have the degree of subtlety. But according to Master Nagarjuna's philosophical assertion, he says that until we are able to uproot or disprove the object which is clung on to by this grasping at some true existence of the psychophysical aggregates, we cannot uproot the grasping at a person. And so there is no degree of subtlety between the selflessness of persons and selflessness of phenomena within this school of thought, because both clinging, both graspings actually hold on to some kind of a true independent existence in persons and things. So grasping at true existence of a person actually hold on to an independent or inherent existence of a person. And that is in turn rooted in the called grasping at an inherent existence of the aggregate. And so, and therefore the absence of true existence or independent existence in the person and the aggregates, which is emptiness. There is no degree of difference in the subtlety between these two. So this is what the Madhyamakas, who do not assert any objective existence in things, have to say. Whereas certain schools of thought within the Madhyamaka philosophy, philosophical school says that grasping at true existence of phenomena is not the fundamental root of samsara as such. Of course, ultimately that is the root. That the root of samsara, get back to that, is rooted in that. But that itself is not the root of samsara as such. But grasping at some independent or existence, true existence of a person is the root of samsara. That's what they say. So both the schools, Prasangikas and the Savatrantikas, are the followers of the same teacher. So within the teaching of the Buddha, there are those teachings which pertain to our clinging to some kind of a substantially sufficient the existing I. And once you are able to overcome that kind of grasping, I mean the attachment and anger and so forth, which are based on such a view, can be kind of overcome, but then not the deeper kind of negative emotions. So we have these 4 different philosophical schools within Buddhism, and I just wanted to say this, that the Chittamatras say that there's no external objects. In order to actually avert the attachment and anger towards that are directed to external things. So we cannot actually find anything that we can pinpoint or point a finger at, pinpoint as being this and that. But whatever we see are in the nature of consciousness, according to Chittamatra view. And so with regard to this, even scientists today, they say that as long as there is an observer, there is an observed object. But when there is no observer, or observing an observer in the sense of a mind, then there is no observed object as such. So even Dignaga says that because the observed and the observer are simultaneous, the conceptual mind which sees the blue, color blue, and the observed object which is the blue, because they are simultaneous, therefore they are not substantially distinct or separate. And so in this way, the Chittamatras refute or reject any externality in things. And therefore, this counters our attachment or passion in relation to the external things. But as a student of Nagarjuna, although the Chittamatras say that there is non-duality between subject and object, but then still they hold on to the idea that this consciousness has some essential existence. Of course, rejecting the externality of things may be okay, but then when it comes to your experience, the internal experience, within which we have this clinging to some essence in things, if that is not actually countered, then it doesn't help to counter or to reject the externality of things. And therefore, the Madhyamikas reject any true existence in both the external things as well as internal experience. So in this way, what you can find is the difference in subtlety between the different schools of thought in their philosophical assertions. So if you actually, these 2 verses, if you can understand it on the basis of this understanding of the philosophical schools, it would be really helpful. We need to study Buddha Palita's text, and then particularly the Bhavaviveka's Madhyamaka Hridaya, the essence of the middle way, for understanding the philosophical schools regarding these two verses. The way it said, what is that? They who imagine truth in untruth and see untruth in truth never arrive at truth, but follow vain desires. And they who know truth in truth and untruth in untruth arrive at truth and follow true desires. So here the term desire is Holiness is actually, I think, trying to made it more, I call, broader. In the sense that the Tokpa. Yeah, chapter 1. Which number are we? I forget. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Chapter 1, verses 11 and 12. To understand them well, you have to actually understand the different philosophical explanations or philosophical assertions. So the quantum physicists talking about they're talking about the observer and the observed object. Of course, they do not have no explanation of the internal experience of mind as such, but they do actually observe the objects. So when they actually search for the things, the observed objects, they cannot find anything that they can actually pinpoint as having any objective existence externally. And therefore, they say that nothing exists objectively. So as the Madhyamaka Avatara says, that the things, whatever they are, do not have any inherent existence. So of course, things may appear to have some objective external existence from their own side, but when you actually look for that in the things, you cannot actually find anything as having any objective existence from their side. And so quantum physics also comes to the same conclusion, saying that there's nothing that is objectively there. But as long as there is an observer and there is an observed thing. So what is taught in the Chittamatra and the Madhyamaka philosophical schools and explained and asserting the different philosophical the concepts or theories. And accordingly, within the teaching of the Buddha, the Chittamatras and the Madhyamakas make distinction between what are the provisional or interpretable teachings and what are definitive teachings, according to their own philosophical understanding. And then with regard to the Four Noble Truths, we need to base our understanding, expanded on the two truths. So because there are the two truths, therefore the mind which sees things, the ultimate reality of things, and that it cannot be explained or described, interpreted otherwise. So we have that kind of mind or wisdom, realizing the ultimate reality of things. On the one hand, this wisdom, and then on the other hand, without going into any kind of analysis into the things, we just accept what is found or accepted in convention without going into any scrutiny about the things. And so there are these two truths. Because of finding through the ultimate reality through analysis and establishing things on conventional terms. So accordingly, we have the paths, the skillful means, or the method and wisdom paths leading to the two attainment of the two bodies of a Buddha. As Master Nagarjuna says, and Master Nagarjuna goes on to say that without relying on the conventional terms, we cannot arrive at the ultimate reality. And he goes on also to say that the Buddhas, all the teachings of the Buddhas are based on the two truths, the ultimate and the conventional. And so the ultimate reality is how things exist, how things are. And then with regard to the provisional or the interpretable teachings and the definitive teachings, there are the Madhyamaka understanding of these teachings, and then the Chittamatra or the Yogacara understanding of the provisional and the definitive teachings. And so, as I said this morning, we need to come to the conclusions of these teachings, and after having gone through them, we need to actually use reason and experiment the teaching of the Buddha, and then accept it. According to this is how it's done in the Nalanda tradition. And so, what is not found in as false, when we actually check into the teachings, we're not here talking about definitive or provisional teachings, but generally the teaching of the Buddha, when we actually check into the content, if we find the teachings actually going against reason, inconsistent with reason, then we should not accept them literally. So even if it may be a teaching of the Buddha, the more you do, if you actually find inconsistency when you actually put them under the test of reasoning, then of course we cannot accept them literally. And so the teaching of the Buddha has to do with our rational mind. We need to come to the conclusion through rational mind. And of course here I'm not saying that the Buddhism is the best religion, because whether something is good or bad is dependent on the to whom they are taught. And so certain teachings which are taught to Chittamatras, someone who has the capacity to actually take the Chittamatra philosophical ideas to someone like that, a person like that, if we teach the Madhyamaka understanding of emptiness, that won't fit the person. And therefore, for those who can actually take the Chittamatra view, the Chittamatra teachings which are meant for the Chittamatras would be befitting, and the Madhyamaka's teachings or the teachings meant for the Madhyamakas actually harm them. And so in accordance with the interest of the sentient beings, mental dispositions, as well as past karmic imprints from the past karma, if we are able to give some teaching which is appropriate for such person, we can say that kind of teaching is the best for that particular person. And we cannot say that Buddhism is best for all kinds of people following different religious traditions. And it is said in the 400 verses by Aryadeva, for those with an duller mind or inferior called intellect, teaching on selflessness will not help. In fact, the teaching, the view of selfhood or Atman is more befitting to them. And therefore, the Buddha himself, when he gave teachings, sometimes have said that, the person is the carrier of the load and the five aggregates are the loads. So, indicating as if there is self. So within the teachings and the religious traditions, we have a religious side and then the philosophical aspect. So with regard to the philosophical aspect, of course, you cannot, from the point of view of the philosophical aspect, you cannot say this is the best religion or that is the best religion, because it depends on the disciples, the followers. So what I have been speaking is quite a tough subject, but the Youth Buddhist Association here have a plan to establish a Buddhist study center here, and so I will also help whatever I can help you with. And so what I have been explaining has some connection or relation to the academic studies. And therefore, because it's important, I have been talking about them, although it's tough to understand these philosophical schools, ideas and concepts and so forth. And then the next verses shows that if you do negative actions, you have negative consequences, and if you do virtuous actions, you will have positive consequences. And then verses 19 and 20 in the first chapter So as these verses say, that you first need to listen to the teachings, and then not only leave at that, but you have to reflect on the teachings. And whatever understanding and certainty you have gained through your reflection must be used in your meditation, and therefore to cultivate meditation. So, although you may have very extensive learning, and you should still reflect on the teaching, and then you will be able to practice. Otherwise, not. If you don't use it in this way, it's no use. But even if you may not have very extensive learning, you should, if you reflect on whatever you have heard, and then apply those teachings within yourself in meditation, then it will be helpful for you. Good for you. So the verses say, the virtuous man is happy in this world. The thoughtless man. The virtuous man is happy in this world, and he is happy in the next. He is happy in both. He is happy when he thinks of the good he has done. He is still more happy when going on the path. And then the thoughtless man, even if he can recite a large portion of the law, but is not a doer of it has no share in the priesthood, but is like a cowherd counting the cows of others. Okay, this verse, this verse, the thoughtless man, even if he can recite a large portion of the law or the Dhamma, but is not a doer of it, has no share in the priesthood, but is like a cowherd counting the cows of others. And then the next verse is the follower of the law, even if he can recite only a small portion of the law, but having forsaken passion and hatred and foolishness, possesses true knowledge and serenity of mind. He, caring for nothing in this world and that to come, has indeed a share in the priesthood. And then the next verse, in the next chapter, chapter 2, is very important. So with regard to the negative emotions, we have negative emotions which are not, which have no view as such, but there are those negative emotions which are actually of view. So with regards to the former types of negative emotions, which are not views, for example, attachment, when it comes to there's the gross state of attachment, they are without views, but then they are not views. But then when it comes to the subtle attachment, they are actually are influenced by these views. And so there are attachments which do not go with the view of grasping at true existence, and there are those which actually are concordant with them, concomitant with them. So when you see the truth directly, the ultimate truth directly, then that serves as a direct counterforce to our distorted views of. And the first verse in the chapter 2, earnestness is the path of immortality, nirvana, thoughtlessness, the path of death. Thoughtlessness, the path of death. Those who are in earnest not to die, those who are thoughtless do not die, those who are thoughtless are as if dead already. So long as you are under the power of negative emotions, then you also undergo death, the Mara of death, subject to the Mara of death. So in order to win over or defeat these two, the negative emotions, the Maras of negative emotions and also the Mara of death, we have the grasping at true existence, the ignorance, and within ignorance, the subtlest one is the ignorance grasping at true existence. And so this is what Master Nagarjuna mentions. So because of the grasping at true existence in things, which is the root of samsara, he says the rest of the 12 links of dependent origination ensue from there. And therefore, Master Nagarjuna also says, as long as you nestle your mind within this true grasping, how come you cannot have any negative emotions? And therefore, one should first listen to the teaching on how the grasping at true existence is combated, and then having heard this, you should reflect on them, reason and so forth, and then you need to apply that in meditation practice. And so for that, you need to first in order to develop the insight into the selflessness or the lack of any true existence and things, you need also to have a powerful concentration. For that, you need to develop mindfulness and introspection. And these are built through the practice of morality. And so when you familiarize yourself with mindfulness and introspection, then you will be able to gain strength in the power of mindfulness and introspection, and you'll be able to develop concentration. And with that help of that concentration, single-pointed concentration, you focus your mind on how things actually are, and then develop the experience of the suppleness of the body and of physical and mental suppleness and pliancy. And so through that you develop single-point concentration further, and then the insight, the special insight into the true things. And so this is what is meant, shown in this verse. Having earnestness is the path of immortality, and nirvana, thoughtlessness, the path of death. Those who are in the earnest do not die. Those who are thoughtless are as if dead. So having understood this clearly, those who are advanced in earnestness delight in earnestness and rejoice in the knowledge of the Aryas, the elect. Elect. When I'm requested to give teachings on the Dharma, that Buddhism, I always consider it very important to give an introductory teaching in order to actually make people understand what Buddhism is about. Because without really understanding the teaching of the Buddha, the Buddhism, with merely faith will not really help that much. So we, as humans, have this marvelous brain, and the Buddhism actually makes us use this brain by doing analysis into things, investigation into things. So through that, then what we need to see is what are the beneficial that need to be adopted, and what are those things which in the short run or long term are harmful to oneself and others, and to discard. And so we need to be able to differentiate between these two, what are to be adopted and what are to be discarded. And through this we need to actually check whether this nirvana is something which is possible or not, whether there is something called nirvana or not. So when you actually find through reasoning, analysis and investigation that nirvana is something which is possible to attain, then of course you'll be able to have the aspiration to pursue that. Otherwise not. In the text of Haribhadra, called The Clear Meaning, it is mentioned that there's this mention of two different types of persons, one who is dull-witted and the other sharp-witted. So the latter actually practices taking refuge in the three jewels by understanding what the three objects of refuge are. And so most of the Indian classical commentarial treatises actually go through these 4 points of the seeing, the purpose, and then what is the benefit of knowing the content, the subject matter, and not only the temporary benefit, but also the ultimate long-term benefit. It's not right just to say, oh, this something is sacred, therefore you actually pay homage to them. But you need to actually understand the teaching of the Buddha, the Buddhism, through this kind of introduction. And once, if you are able to build your faith based on reason and understanding, then you have a faith which is actually complemented by wisdom. And also with regard to compassion, this has to be the case, that it has to be complemented by wisdom, without which you may not be able to make a breakthrough in your realization. So if you believe in a creator God, the best gift that the creator has given us is this brain. So we need to use this brain maximally. And so that's why I do this kind of introductory teaching. So today we'll finish here and then we'll continue tomorrow.